when Bernie Sanders had his kind of stint of referencing these countries and saying, oh, well, they're socialist and they're successful, we had leaders from those countries come out and say, no, 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 we're market economies.
Hey everyone, my name is Melissa Woodford. I'm here with Conservative Shoutout, and today I have the privilege of having Luke Negron on. So Luke, actually, he ran for the 18th Congressional District last year in Pennsylvania. He went to Grove City College and he majored in political science. He minored in national security and communications, and he is here with us today to talk about socialism. So first, I want to thank you so much for coming on today, Luke, and I have a quick question before we start. Did you actually say about your opponent when you were running last year that he had about the energy and enthusiasm of a melted ice cream cone?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I believe it was like the passion and presence of a melted ice cream cone. But
Okay,
yeah, I stand by it. It's true. Yes.
That is great. Well, we're so grateful to have young people like you running for office and standing for those principles that you think are important. So first off, can you just kick us off with explaining what socialism is and how it differs from communism?
Yeah, of course. So socialism and communism really are two parallel roads to the same destination. I think this is something that a lot of Americans, especially Gen Zers and millennials, get wrong. Most of us are pretty comfortable alienating ourselves from communism. But when it comes to socialism, or the made up term democratic socialism, which is just socialism made to sound more palatable, we think, oh, well, that's not so bad. So they want the same exact destination. As a matter of fact, I have my good old copy of the Communist Manifesto here. I want to read you something that Karl Marx, the founder of communism, says about communism and how it relates to socialism. So he says, the history of the manifesto reflects to a great extent the history of the modern working class movement. At present, it is undoubtedly the most widespread and most international production of all socialist literature. So he goes on there, but that is to say, the founder of communism recognized that the Communist Manifesto was a product of socialist literature. He categorized them as one and the same. So how I would differentiate the two is that socialism is communism by more mild means. So socialism is attaining a centralization of production of goods and services and of governmental power through social change. So through taking over entertainment and education. Communism is saying, let's win one election and then let's kill or imprison all of our political opposition. It's a bit more hard-handed and heavy-handed, but they're the same thing. They want the same end goal.
Wow. And that is quite terrifying for you to actually read the words of Karl Marx and for you to point out that even that text itself said that socialism kind of can lead to communism. So that is really terrifying. So thanks for bringing up those examples. So I guess then, with that said, how do you think there's such a massive movement today of people who find this appeal for socialism? We see people like the Squad with Nancy Cortez from Westchester, better known as AOC. We see this huge appeal. So why do you think it's so popular these days? Why are so many people on Instagram falling for these ideas of socialism?
It's because it feels good. It sounds so nice and it feels so good, right? Especially when we're driving down the road and maybe you're a high school student driving some $800 car that you were just able to afford, and you see some guy pass by you in a Mercedes, right? Or in some kind of Lamborghini, and you think, couldn't he afford to give me a little bit of his money to make my car a little better? That's kind of like, that's the type of emotion that we see in everyday America. But what we miss is that the ability for us to grow, the ability for us to grow out of the working class into the upper class, to make more money, to make a name for ourselves, that is taken away entirely in socialism and communism. So it sounds so good. Take from, right, it's like Robin Hood, not the app, which is now failing, but the person,
which
right?
does the opposite purpose of what it's
which
saying.
does the opposite, was exposed just last week. But it's like Robin Hood, hey, take a little from the rich and give to the poor. But what it misses is the idea that when we do that, number one, we kill competition. Number two, we kill growth. We kill the ability to grow. We kill fairness. And the fairness here is a big one for Americans, because when you start thinking of how we are as a culture, we love a good, fair competition. You look at a football game. Today's going to be the Super Bowl. We love when one team wins and one team loses, as long as there's fairness in the process. As long as the refs call what they should call, each team gets a set number of people on the field, and it's fair. That's called capitalism. That's called free markets. Everyone competes in fair rules, and there's a winner and there's a loser, and we love that. That's competition. It's beautiful. And then it also ignores the big one for me, is that socialism and communism always, always, always come down to an abusive, elitist ruling class who plays by their own set of rules. So there's the peons who are all equally poor and equally oppressed, and then the elitist ruling class, whether those are movie stars or politicians or military people, the people in power, they're always in their own circle playing by their own set of rules, and they always get drunk on that power every single time historically.
Mm. Wow. Well, I really appreciate you just kind of laying that out more and saying how there's such appeal to it today. I'm also kind of wondering, how do you think we can get back to an appreciation of capitalism? You mentioned we like a good competition. We like watching the Super Bowl, one team wins. How do you think we can, as Christians, influence people to look to capitalism as a healthy thing and something that will actually make everyone more rich in the end?
Yeah, so this is something that I think there's a twofold approach to. One is simply sharing the full story. So talking a little bit about the history of socialism and communism, what it has done to the world, and the history of free markets, of capitalism, or of mixed markets, at least, where there's at least a trend towards true free markets and the good that those have done for the world. So that's kind of the academic side. Those are great discussions to have. And you have to tailor your discussion, though, to the individual. Some people don't want to just hear stats and history. They want to hear more of an experience or more anecdotal evidence, something more emotional. And for that second part that I alluded to, that's the emotional side where you have to draw an experience. That's actually something I'm working with now in a pack that I'm starting, working largely with Venezuelan immigrants. These are individuals around my age and your age who grew up in a market economy. They grew up in a free society under a democracy and a capitalist regime. And then it got taken over by radical socialists who started imprisoning and killing political opposition. And these people, our age, now had to flee their country, much like people from the USSR or from Nazi Germany, because they are in danger of either their lives if they disagree politically, or of being impoverished forever under the socialist regime. So that type of very personal experience and appeal from people today who have experienced it, I think it is really powerful as well.
That's exactly right. I think that pointing out those examples of people who have fled socialism in themselves and have come to America it's so important that we do that. I'm wondering,
Yeah.
So you had mentioned a little bit about your personal experience in that. I'm wondering, can you give any examples of socialism today that we can say that people point to as good examples, but they might not actually be true examples of socialism?
Yeah, of course. So one is the country I just mentioned, right? Venezuela. Actually, we see the BLM founders, Opal Tometi is buddy with the authoritarian ruler of Venezuela, who is currently imprisoning and killing political opposition. Venezuela is a failed state. It is a state that has led many of its citizens to flee. And sadly, many organizations in the U.S., including the largest BLM, have ties and are very supportive of that absolutely abusive state. Another one is some people like to reference Central and Northern Europe, right? Like Denmark. I find it ironic that when Bernie Sanders had his kind of stint of referencing these countries and saying, oh, well, they're socialist and they're successful, we had leaders from those countries come out and say, no, we're market economies. Like we just want to set the record straight. We're not socialist. Not only that, it is true that they have implemented more socialist policies in recent history, but they are still a mixed economy, and they built their wealth and stability on capitalism. Only in the last decade or less have they started implementing socialism. So for people to point at them and say that's a socialist success story is really disingenuous. If in 50 years they're fully socialist and fully successful, then we might have a conversation. But even then, you'd still be milking off some of the benefits of the capitalism that built your country. So those are two examples that jump right to mind.
That is so helpful. And I know Venezuela, like you mentioned, unfortunately, it was once one of the richest countries in the world. And also,
Yeah.
it is one of the most nutrient or mineral rich countries. Things like toilet paper, milk, flour, and eggs now, you can't even find, or if you can find, their prices are astronomical. So I'm glad you
Yes.
pointed that out. And the irony of Denmark, too, for them having their own prime minister saying that about themselves being a market economy. What about places like Sweden, or I think in the past you may have mentioned Cuba? Could you speak to any other countries like those, or also possibly even Brazil as a possible example of socialism?
Yeah, so Sweden, I'd say, really falls into the same basket as Denmark, where they built their stability on capitalism and on free markets. They're still a mixed market economy, and also they're a much smaller country. They're a country that doesn't have near the geographic, economic, or ethnic diversity that the United States has. All of that ties into why some socialist policies, and I emphasize some that they have, would be a little bit easier to implement there, and their country isn't the size, and they don't have the problems that the United States has. And like I said, the biggest point here for me in these countries are they were built on free markets. They were built on capitalism. Now they're changing a little bit partially. Cuba is another failed state. I mean, I have heritage in Cuba. Fidel and Raul Castro, again, an awful regime for imprisoning people who disagree with them from a religious standpoint, from a political standpoint, and from an economic standpoint. To point to them as a success story, as I know, sadly, some of our elected officials have praised their healthcare system. It's completely false to point to them as any sort of success. There's a reason that people are hopping on inflatable tires and trying to get from Cuba over to southern Florida. It's because life over there is absolutely terrible. And then Brazil, yeah, Brazil is definitely trending more heavily towards the free market side, as they have for decades on end. Brazil loves their trade with China. Unfortunately, that's a problem with us because they are competing with us economically. They love trading with the United States. They are not socialist in their leadership. As a matter of fact, I believe several of their leaders who they just elected are much more towards what we would call the right side of the aisle, the capitalist, democratic side of the aisle, democratic in the sense of democracy, not American Democrats. So yeah, Brazil is a pretty weak example of any sort of socialism being successful.
Right. I'm so glad you mentioned that. I also know for Sweden, we all think of IKEA. Well, actually, the founder of IKEA, he probably is one of the only good exports from Sweden. He left Sweden. And then when you look at Brazil, there's instances where they had raising the minimum wage laws in prior years. In 2002, they elected a socialist. And so they called it social justice. Now you see them in shambles today. Thankfully, like you mentioned, I think they are heading towards more of a capitalist direction. But you look at these examples, everyone points to them as great examples, but then and lots of times they're not actually, like you pointed out, socialist to begin with. So I'm glad you kind of clarified those things for us. That's great.
Yeah, that's right. And these socialist leaders who, when they get the opportunity to really run with the socialism in a full takeover, you see what happens. Cuba is a great example. Venezuela is a great example. The USSR is a great example. That's what happens when you let these ideas play out to their full extent. And that's what we're in danger of here in the United States, is going further and further down that road to the point where we crumble just like these other countries have without fail.
Yes, I totally agree with that. So, going back to the US, if we continue to embrace these ideas that are so devastating, as you read from the very beginning with Karl Marx, what do you think could be the practical, logical conclusion? I know just recently we've heard that the New York Times said that the Biden administration is considering appointing a quote unquote reality czar. So, you never know what you're going to get with the Biden administration now with all these executive orders. But theoretically, if this were to happen, what kind of things do you think we could see with that, with free speech, for instance?
I think it's really dangerous for free speech. So from what I gathered by talking to you, today was the first time I heard about this prospective reality czar. This sounds like the exact opposite of free speech, right? So this is someone, a state official, not just someone, a state official coming out and telling you how history happened, what is currently reality, and insisting on the narrative that can be accepted and is appropriate in the public eye. That is insane. That is entirely authoritarian. That is the type of stuff that we pushed back against at the very founding of our country, is an elitist coming out and telling us peons, right, us villagers, here's how life is, here's how history is, here's what you're allowed to believe and allowed to teach your kids in school, at home. A reality is, I mean, the very name should send shivers up and down people's spine. And I do think, though, that we are fighting ideological battles against that type of a movement in the United States. I love to see that there is still a semblance of states' rights in which red states can kind of push for a good level of change. We see Texas and Florida being two major kind of banner carriers in this sense, where they're strong states with a lot of influence, powerful economies, and thus they're able to influence us on a national level. That's one of the beauties, one of the checks and balances, states' rights, that a lot of people kind of skim over when they look into American history. We still have that. So I think what we've got a lot of fight left in us, and I look forward to being part of it.
I know one thing that's happening exciting here in Florida is that State Representative Anthony Sabatini is trying to push for a bill that will sue social media companies.
Yeah.
So I used to work for him, but I am hoping this bill gets enough traction so that we get people to vote for it in the state of Florida, because the state of Florida, ultimately, let's be real, it's leading the rest of the nation in terms of freedom right now. We are the only state open. We might have the Olympics moved here this summer from Tokyo. So there's a reason that the Super Bowl is happening in Tampa today. And I think that we need to continue to be an example for the rest of the nation. And a lot of people are flocking here from blue states, and I wonder why. I'm grateful for people like you who are fighting and are trying to preserve these principles of freedom of speech, freedom of religion in our country. So I guess with that, Luke, I would just ask, is there anything else that you'd want to add, or any last words of encouragement you think that you would want to share with young Americans like you who are concerned about these freedoms we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So for anyone like you and I who has kind of taken the red pill, right, as it is a modern saying,
Right.
and who knows what's going on, to them, I would say there's a real effort right now to make you feel alone, to make you feel scared, and to make you feel like your voice cannot and should not be heard. You have to push past that. That's noise. Right now, we still have the ability to be heard, to stand up, and to share our message with our circle, right? Or whether that's family, friends, school, anything else, anything larger. You can and should do that. Don't be scared. You're not alone. You're not crazy. There are millions of people in the United States and worldwide who agree with you and appreciate you and value the same things that you do. I am starting a hack that is focusing on reaching young Americans with a message of why socialism and communism are bad. And specifically focusing on hopefully reaching young Hispanics, because I think that as Florida has kind of shown, Cuban Americans, they understand what socialism and communism bring, and they hate it. And so they vote against it. But a lot of other Hispanics, they're met with this kind of propaganda that tells them they should vote Democrat. But at their core, Hispanics are, I have Hispanic heritage, very, very conservative. They're very family oriented, very religious, very hardworking, very much, if you want something, you go out and work for it type of attitude. And so if we can reach them, especially as Joe Biden starts legalizing these 13 million illegal immigrants and make those votes actually conservative votes, that's kind of the mission of the PAC, is to reach people with that message and hopefully win over a lot of Hispanics. Reach out anytime at Real Luke Negron on Instagram. All my other social medias are linked there. I love talking with people, especially the undecided folks, because those are the ones who we want to reach, right? The echo chamber is only so effective.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. I'm really glad that you shared that. We need to continue to speak up. Thank you so much, Luke, for coming on today, just explaining socialism for us. We really appreciate having you here. And as again, you mentioned it yourself, please follow Luke on his Instagram channel. He has some great videos there, and he is really fighting for the freedoms that we so cherish in our nation, and he's doing a great job at it. So thank you so much again for coming on, Luke. We're really glad to have you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.